What's up, guys? Rick from DFS On Demand here, and I just wanted to make a quick video slash podcast in regards to the big news that we got this week that DraftKings and the PGA Tour have finally signed an official partnership deal together. So I'll walk through what we know about that deal, potentially any implications, and really just the blue sky, dream of what this could potentially mean for the industry. Now, this is going to be audio only, so if you're watching it on the YouTube channel, feel free to minimize and just let it play. You're not missing anything. I'm just going to throw the logo up on the screen. So let's get into the details. All right, so if you have not heard already, this week the PGA Tour dropped a news release entitled DraftKings named official daily fantasy game of the PGA Tour. And what it outlines is a multi-year, what they describe as a content and marketing relationship between the PGA Tour and DraftKings. This is, for a lot of reasons, a big deal. For those of you who are aware, the PGA Tour has basically actively avoided anything related to fantasy or gambling in the past. There was a time, Will Wilcox, I think it was, wanted to wear the DraftKings logo on his bag, and the tour shut that down. And they really just didn't want anything to do with daily fantasy or gambling. And I think we're at the point now where there's such a clear, strong correlation between the ratings for golf, especially in a younger demographic, and daily fantasy sports, that it was almost too much to overlook. So there's very little information outside of this press release on what things are actually going to change. So we're just going to kind of speculate a little bit. What I expect, because the tour has, they've kind of tippy-toed into this relationship, right? They weren't the first ones to jump into it. They waited a couple years, all that stuff. I don't expect them to just flip the switch and embrace this in a big way. What I expect off the bat is just new content on the PGA Tour, and maybe within some broadcasts, and maybe on PGA Tour Live, for example. We've already seen Pat Mayo's article for this week is posted on the PGA Tour's website as a preview for the WGC FedEx, which is awesome. All right, already a bunch of new eyes that are going to be able to read his content, presumably on a weekly basis. That's a great thing. And so I just think it's going to start really slow. I think they might mention it more often on PGA Tour Live. We'll see if it gets into the actual broadcasts outside of maybe, I don't know, the Golf Channel or something like that. But all in all, I can't begin to describe to you how big I think this is going to be for the future of fantasy golf. It's one of these situations where, we already knew golf was in such a great place and growing. The tour itself is loaded with absolute studs. Fantasy golf is, in my opinion, the perfect sport for casual fans because it's a weekly aspect. There's no positions. Everyone plays the same position. It's really easy to play. There's a lot to learn. There's new courses every single week. It's just a really perfect fantasy sport in general. And now what we are likely going to see is a bunch of new people being introduced to fantasy sports, to DraftKings specifically. So even if this just turns into, hey, let's run DraftKings ads and commercials during the events. Let's give them 2 minutes on PGA Tour Live, and let's put the content on written content on PGAtour.com. Like, that's already a big win. I think we're going to see an influx of casual fans coming into the game, or coming to fantasy sports and playing, which for me as a, I guess if you want to call myself a content provider, like, I'm obviously very excited about that, right? That's a bunch of new, very selfishly, potential customers for me, right? But it's going to be so good for the game. And think about, like, if a bunch of new casuals come to your sport and you've been playing for 3, 6, 12 months, multiple years, you're already ahead of the game. The game should, in theory, get softer if we were to see an influx of new players coming in and try to figuring everything out. So it's good from a playing aspect as well. So I think this is a real big win. And just to kind of illustrate this, there's probably not another sport that we have seen a true inflection point like this where, you know, DFS golf is fairly mature, right? It's been around for multiple years. There's an infrastructure that is already around it. So it's a fairly mature sport that did not have the backing of the league that it that it represents, right? So I don't know if we've ever had an inflection point like this where, hey, this sport is in existence, it's mature, and now you're flipping the switch to potentially get a bunch of new players. You know, think about football, think about basketball. They've probably gone the opposite way, right? Like at the beginning, it was just they were hitting you over the head with commercials. There was talk about DraftKings on ESPN, and Matt Berry was doing like DFS related stuff, right? So the exposure to DFS in other sports was earlier in the timeline. There's basically been no talk of that on the PGA Tour, and now we're presumably going to get that. So it's a true huge moment potentially for what is to come for daily fantasy golf and fantasy golf in general, which I think is really, really cool. So with that being said, that is kind of my short spiel on what I think is going to happen and my general thoughts. But I want to talk about those, big sky peak partnership potentials that could potentially happen here, and want to get your guys' opinion on anything else that you would like to see and how else they can integrate this. So I tweeted this out, but I want to dive a little bit deeper into it. The first one being a title sponsorship along with a scoring system. So Pat Mayo very correctly has been talking about this for, I don't know, years, where the 100% natural fit is to take this week's Barracuda Championship, which is already in Stableford scoring, change it to be the DraftKings Open, or whatever you want to call it, and use the DraftKings scoring system instead of the Stableford system. That is... quite honestly, I bet you it's a long way away because you're dealing with a lot of sponsors. Some of these deals are multiple years long. You'd have to sign a new big deal. You'd have to change the score. Like that is all, like when we get to that point, we're going to know DraftKings has made it on the PGA Tour, right? Like that's going to be so sick. I assume, you might not, and you might have to make some concessions here if you're DraftKings with the PGA Tour. Maybe you don't do the bonuses, right? You don't do the 3 birdies in a row. You don't do the finishing position, all that stuff. But you just change the Stableford scoring, which I think is, 1 point for a par or whatever it is. Whatever the Stableford system is, you change it over to the DraftKings system and crown your champion that way. Feels like such a perfect natural fit. Absolutely love that. Next up, and what I think is kind of equally as important is if the PGA Tour kind of opens the floodgates on this, or just kind of allows opens the lid and allows sponsorships on players, right? Seeing guys with DraftKings on their bag, DraftKings on their shirt, as silly as that sounds, I think goes a long way. Whether we like it or not, I think we can name a lot of the players' sponsors. We know who the Nike guys are. We know that Ricky's a Puma guy. We know that Morgan Stanley is rocking Justin Rose's hat. Like subliminal. Like I don't like it, but like that stuff exists. People get it, and there have absolutely been sponsors that I'm like, what the heck is that? Like Grant Thornton or whatever. Like, let me Google that. Like Dean and DeLuca. Like, what is that company? I've done that, and for people who are already watching, it's a much more natural fit to be like, oh, DraftKings. Let me go see what that's all about. It just adds such a layer of validity to what is going on at DraftKings for it to show up in PGA Tour official capacities and on players. So I'm really excited about that. I also think you might get golfers that interact a lot more on Twitter about, such fantasy sports, good or bad. That's a little scary thinking about people really tweeting at these guys if they cost them money, which is silly. But, I think there'll be guys that embrace it. As far as some technology goes, something that we've always talked about is the ability to watch any player or any hole, not limited to just the coverage, right? We've talked through the technical constraints and how hard it would be with having so many cameras out there. Like we know the possibilities, but I think, and I'm hoping that the industry of fantasy sports drives the PGA Tour to either significantly improve the shot tracker, whether it is more accurate, more in real time, more descriptive, something like that, right? Or find a way to get us 2 cameras on every hole, one from the fairway and then one, pointing back towards the tee, and then one like behind the green pointing up, right? As you can see approaches, like 2 stationary cameras that you could on Thursday morning at 6:50 a.m. click and say, I need to watch the 13th hole because Johnny Vegas just teed off. And there's a market for that. And really what it should be, the infrastructure is already in place for for PGA Tour Live. Finding a way to expand that outside of just featured groups, charging people a lot more for it. That to me, I think you can get PGA Tour Live for $60 a year, which is the steal of a lifetime. Let me tell you that. With what Sunday ticket is for the NFL, with how much league pass costs for the NBA, the PGA Tour is an absolute steal. And I think they know it's because they only offer, usually like Thursday, Friday coverage, handful of groups, whatever. It's limited. Expand that, charge a lot more for it, and get every fantasy player to buy it. And now you're in business. Also, I imagine at some point, and hopefully we'll get a lot of like integration into the graphics, right? Integration into leaderboards. So when you see a guy who is putting for birdie, that would come up and say, oh, putting for birdie, that would be worth, 3 points on DraftKings, or this would be his 3rd birdie in a row or something like that. When a graphic shows, the players, what shot they're on, what position, they're in the FedEx Cup, which quite frankly, don't get me started on that. The FedEx Cup position, on any shot during the tournament is the absolute worst use of graphic space I've ever seen. It never changes. It doesn't matter in the moment. I don't care at all. Put up how many DraftKings points they've scored, right? Like what are they at to this point? He's got 55 and a half DraftKings points. That's what he's at. Like that would be a much better use and an easier integration for this partnership. And then finally, I guess maybe a couple more things. There was talk about finding a way to get data providers more data, easier access to it, going back to an open source opportunity where, like the NBA is pretty good at this. Major League Baseball through StatCast, like there's just a lot more stuff out there. I would love to see that opened up in a way that guys like us can really consume it. We can talk about it. We can dive deeper into it. We can write articles about it. Whatever that ends up being, feels like probably the longest shot because the PGA Tour is kind of pretty secretive and protective of that. And I don't think it's necessary for this partnership, but I think it would be very helpful to kind of just take the aging demographic of golf fans and viewers of golf, try to bring that age down through the use of fantasy, sports betting, data, like all of that stuff. Just bring the average age down, which I think is what the tour absolutely needs to do. So that's one. And then finally, in terms of a specific partnership with these sites, like I think golf is the only site the only sport that doesn't have a live final. Right, the Fantasy Golf World Championships is an online final. I think even the NHL gets a live final, and not that it even necessarily had to have been at a golf course or at the tournament. Like DraftKings probably could have put the live final next door somewhere, or just gone somewhere and played golf, and you don't even have to be in the same city as the tournament that it's going on. Hopefully this opens up a lot of opportunity for that, right? Get a tent outside the 18th green or something like that. let everybody sweat out the live final and grow the buzz, grow the game, and really start branding it at the events as well. So that's it. That's my first thoughts. Overall, so incredibly stoked about this. I think it opens up a lot of opportunity for everyone. I'm very excited to see what comes out of it. I am cautiously optimistic. I think it is going to take time for these two entities to figure out what the heck is going on and how they want to actually partner up. But I'm looking forward to it. If you have any ideas, what do you want to see out of this partnership, please let me know. Leave a comment below or tweet me. It's at DFS On Demand, and we'll talk soon. See ya.